All right, we're going to cross over to Chris Bambery. He's a political commentator also joining us on the line from London. Mr. Bambery, thank you for joining us here on Press TV. I'd like to get your opinion as we enter the fourth night of this unrest in the UK. How do you view the situation?
Well, this afternoon, shops and local businesses across London were shutting down early, worried there was going to be further looting in the capital. And in the area I was, by mid-afternoon, the shutters were coming down on local supermarkets and other shops, and there were gangs of young, mainly black people being pursued by police around the area. And I think in London there was a great fear tonight. Now, the response after 3 nights of rioting of the Cameron government has been to move, as your correspondent says, 16,000 police into the capital. And that seems to have, so far this evening, prevented any major outbreaks, although we are hearing of stories of outbreaks in Canning Town and earlier in Wembley and elsewhere. But the rioting has spread to Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Manchester, with quite serious outbreaks in the centre of Manchester. And I think that shows that what we're dealing with here is a pent-up anger against the police in particularly black communities over the continuance of institutionalized racism in the police force, but a wider anger, which also means that young people, and I was looking at the film of the rioting in central Manchester, and many of the young people were white, they share that frustration, and also other frustrations about what life in Britain means today for being young. Unemployment very high here, like Tottenham when the riots began, nearly 30%. In Salford, where there's been trouble tonight, some 40% youth unemployment, where there are students who are facing being priced out of university education because of the policy of this government. And I think you can sense that frustration coming through. And one of the crucial issues for many people around where I live and across London is the reintroduction of stop and search, where the police have the right to arbitrarily stop you, and particularly young people, and particularly black young people, and search them with no reason. And that in the past has caused riots and massive resentment in the black community and wider, and it's one of the issues underlying this issue, which of course was triggered by a police killing on Thursday, which has still not been satisfactorily explained.
Right, we're also being joined on the line by Professor Rodney Shakespeare. He's a professor of binary economics. Professor Shakespeare, I'd like to get your opinion on this. Do you see this mounting anger that we are witnessing on the streets of UK just being directed towards the police, or is this eventually going to force Cameron and his cabinet to review some of the policies that we've seen being protested against by the people in the UK over the past year, but have produced absolutely no results?
First of all, it's relatively quiet in London, but there are some sporadic outbursts. They cannot maintain this number of 16,000 police, and I think a key day is going to be Thursday, whether they're going to introduce some form of martial law in London, because, frankly, there's been a massive economic, political, and social failure. To your question, they cannot easily address the issues. They are so large scale. It's a failure of a whole economic system, which has meant that people are no longer employed. It's a particular failure of the UK educational system, which means a whole percentage of young people are put out into the world without the ability to read, write, or calculate. It's also a moral failure. In some way, you're looking at the collapse of a society. It's also, look at consumerism. These young people are told that they're only sort of adult and real people and independent if, in fact, they've bought sports shoes or cosmetics or new clothes. And some of the scenes in those shops were of young people behaving exactly like ordinary consumers, except they weren't paying money, they were actually taking the things, but looking at themselves in the mirror and trying on clothing for the right size. So it's gone wrong in very, very profound ways, and there is not a short way out of it, because you see, our government basically thinks it represents something called the free market, which is perfect, and it doesn't think that anything fundamental has to be corrected. And on top of this, they're doing things like withdrawing the educational maintenance allowance. So looking at it as a whole, I think the thing is going to go on, and you're going to see at least local introductions of a form of martial law.
Right, Mr. Bambery, martial law, do you agree with that assessment? Because a lot is riding on this for the government. Let's not forget Olympics 2012, where the government has been working towards portraying London as the safest city in the world. A bit embarrassing for them right now, isn't it?
Well, they had over 200 Olympians here today looking at the facilities on offer for the Olympics next year. I think it's very embarrassing, and many of your listeners might be wondering, is it a good idea to come to London next summer? But I think this government has witnessed the biggest outbreak of rioting for over 3 decades. It's witnessed the biggest protest by the trade unions in some 3 decades. It's witnessed the biggest student movement in three decades, and this is within little over a year. This government has done wonders about bringing people onto the streets, either in peaceful protest or now in rioting. And I think there is a mix here over which this government is responsible for. I mean, there are real issues which have to be addressed. Many young black boys in the area I live are excluded from secondary school with no education provision given for them. That means in their early teens they are literally thrown onto the street and told how to survive. And many of them will find ways of surviving, which unfortunately are not, within the law. I think it's also correct to say about the question of consumerism. We are in a society which has celebrated wealth for a tiny minority for 30 years, where you're told that, if you're wealthy, flaunt it. No wonder that given half a chance, people with no money actually turn to looting department stores. I'm not trying to condone that, but I can understand it. And I think it's hypocritical for people to be saying, these young people are responsible for taking away people's houses, when, for instance, the banks who've driven the British economy into the ground are taking people's houses away because they can't afford to pay for the loans those banks gave them. There is a lot of hypocrisy coming around. David Cameron used to live, before he became Prime Minister, in the area I live in. Cheek by jowl with some of the people who are on the streets, young people who are on the streets tonight. They know that the likes of Cameron don't use state schools, state hospitals. They rely on the private sector. They've got the money to do that. Cameron himself, up until last night, was on holiday in Italy and Tuscany. They'll never be able to afford a holiday in Italy and Tuscany. And there's a sense of them and us. And London is a huge centre of wealth, but it's also a massive centre of poverty. And what we're seeing is that division between rich and poor coming home with a vengeance on the streets of London and other English cities tonight.
Right. Professor Shakespeare, the unrest, as both of you have mentioned, is a result of mounting dissatisfaction with government policies over years now. But isn't this the right time for government and representatives to reach beyond the aisle and start earnestly looking for solutions, as opposed to throwing 1,600 police forces onto the streets of UK to control the protests?
Yes, indeed, it is time for to look for solutions, but you're looking at a mindset and a culture which is going downhill, and it doesn't really realize it's going downhill, and it doesn't know what to do. I mean, let's take one example. You take the USA and its wars abroad. It's putting out billions and billions of its spending is actually going abroad. That is the consequence of all its 6 military wars and its 70 troops in 70 countries. Now, that expenditure is not in the American economy, and the British economy, to a certain extent, has the same thing there. And then you look at the export of jobs. In both countries, they've exported their jobs. You see, they followed the desires and the interests of a parasite group of elitist, wealthy companies, and in particular of wealthy bankers. And the philosophy and interests of these groups have got nothing to do with the creation of the real economy and the problems of ordinary people. Now, this thinking, by the way, why I disagree with Chris on one point is that, yes, this government is getting it wrong, but goodness me, the previous government was just as much part of creating the debt and then thinking that everything was going wrong and at the same time exporting our jobs, as is the existing government. And in America, do not think that there's any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. They're all in this, and they're selling out Main Street, just as ordinary people are being sold out in this country. They will not address the issues. Number one they should address, they must challenge the bankers. They must challenge the idea that what the bankers do is for the good of everybody else. It's not. It, in fact, is destroying everything, putting us into more and more unrepayable debt. Now, the young people are another aspect of the thing, and they effectively do not feel part of their society. And to be blunt, most of them are in a situation where they will not become part of the society because they've been betrayed. In particular, they've been betrayed by the educationalists. I think that a lot of the educationalists actually want to create an underclass. This seems to be part of the British psychology, because they've created people who, even if there are jobs, and there are not, but even if there are jobs, they will not be the ones to actually get those jobs. And as a result, you're getting a response of hostility to a society which they basically feel they've been excluded from.
All right, let me just bring in our correspondent, Nagas Mobalaghi, who's waiting on the line from London. Nagas, we've been talking about the imposition of martial law in London, the possibility of it. Do you have more information on it, and how are the people responding to such an implication?
Well, I have to say, actually, especially today, I could see that at least the media line was towing closer towards some sort of army presence in the streets of London. I don't see it as probable, but I don't see it as impossible, because London has not faced this citywide and actually spreading across the country to some of the other big cities as well. We've seen in the last few decades pockets of violence in certain areas as a reaction to certain social and economic problems. We've just never seen it at this scale. Interestingly enough, I think actually London was on curfew today. Maybe they didn't announce it, but when shops are told by their local police forces to close early, when people are told to go home from work early, which about 80% of my own friends who I spoke to across the city that happened to, they were told to go home early. When you have right now London quieter than I've ever seen it, yes, I think there was some sort of curfew, and I think maybe it wasn't said, maybe it wasn't announced, but London was not functioning as it usually does today. I think both of your guests have picked up on some of the key points that are at play here right now, and British people don't like talking about class, but one of the issues at play here is exactly that. One area of West London, Ealing, was attacked last night. Today, all the major stations inside the UK were reporting from there, and the news anchors were very clearly saying, oh, well, we understand why it's happening in Hackney or Lambeth or Tottenham, but why in the sunny, leafy suburbs of Ealing? This is just not unacceptable. So you could almost see this astonishment that this unrest had dared to spill over to some of the more affluent areas of London. And that actually, incidentally, did set and offend many people, and many people I was speaking to today kind of saw it as a turning point. They were like, hold on, so it's okay if it happens in our area, but if it happens in Ealing or an area like that, then suddenly the rules change.
Right, Mr. Bambery, you've spoken of the social inequalities that have resulted from government policy leading to these protests. What kind of repercussions would this government response hold, as we're seeing it transpiring these few nights, in the long run, in your opinion?
Well, I think this government, and I do agree with my fellow guest, I think the government has no other policy in terms of economic matters than to carry on with free market policies, carrying on the work of the previous government, but I also believe it will only respond to the howls of rage from the right-wing media, which is for further crackdown, and that is what Cameron has said. More police, more arrests. There's no attempt to address the problems here, and there are fundamental problems here. I live in an area of London where within a short walk of about a 15-minute walk, you can go from one side of Hyde Park in an area, a poor area. You cross Hyde Park, the average age for a man increases by 17 years. That is crossing one park in central London from a poor area to a rich area. That is a huge gap. In Glasgow, there are parts of the city of Glasgow, a life expectancy for men is lower than in Bangladesh. Now, we're talking about one of the fourth or fifth richest country in the world, and the extremes of rich and poverty are really in people's face. And each of the successive governments, Thatcher, Blair, Brown, and now Cameron, have celebrated wealth creation. And people, and I think Professor Shakespeare's point is absolutely right. If you're taught that the means of success is having the right car, the right mobile phone, the right pair of trainers, the right designer clothes, and you don't have the money to do that, and this is what you've been drummed into you, then you're going to grab the first opportunity to go out and get those things. And that's what we're seeing. It's a very elemental form of rage. A riot is the most primitive of form of protest. But it is a form of protest against what's going on, and Cameron must be very worried about this, because the cuts in spending and the austerity measures which the government is introducing, which will see the biggest fall in public spending Britain's experienced in living memory, the biggest fall in living standards in living memory, and an increase in unemployment, are only now beginning to bite. This is the beginning of that process. And if we have rioting on the streets of London and other cities now, what can we look forward to in the next 2, 3, 4 years as things get substantially worse in this country?
Indeed. Now, speaking of David Cameron, Professor Shakespeare, Cameron and his senior advisors will hold a second emergency meeting in Whitehall on Wednesday morning with the leadership of Scotland Yard to discuss the impact of this beefed-up police operation in London overnight. What do you think is going to take place in that meeting?
Well, one thing, curfew has been raised, and I think it's absolutely certain that a curfew in some form for young people of a particular age up to a certain time at night will be used as part of a process to try to impose responsibility not only on the young people, but then if a young person is out, the parents will be called, and if they don't turn up, they will be penalized. It'll be an attempt to get back to some sort of social control over the young people, because that seems to have completely collapsed. So I can see curfew with variations possibly being declared for a short period right way across London, but I would have thought probably the local decision area. You will then, it's all very well for Cameron to sort of talk about the full force of the law, but that's totally negative. This, as Chris Bambery's been said, is going to go on. There's no doubt it's much more fundamental. I mean, Brixton 1981, which was about the police. Tottenham 1985, it was about the police, and then it was also about economic. But this is about economic, financial, it's about class, it's about morality, and it's about a collapse in education for people, as Chris Bambery's rightly pointed out. In this country, we've got top-class schools for our private schools are the best in the world. But when you go into the state school, you've got a complete mixture, and in parts of that state sector, without any doubt, as far as I can see, they deliberately want to turn out people who do not have the basic skills which enable them to survive in a modern society. And everybody needs work. It's about their dignity, it's about their... every job involves solving problems, every job involves responsibility. And if you don't have jobs, then I'm afraid you're creating a generation of people who will be feral, they will be wild, and at some stage they will break out. But anyway, to answer your question, certainly in the immediate future, I would say Nagas is right, forms of curfew.
All right, Mr. Bambery, now that the genie is out of the bottle and certain taboos are being brought into public focus, could we see an honest debate taking place within the society as a whole to discuss these pressing issues?
No. I think that's the problem. It addresses one of the problems. The politics is now restricted to a very narrow debate, as elsewhere in the Western world, between essentially a centre-left and a centre-right who agree on the neoliberal fundamentals. It's like a choice between Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola. And one of the things that's changed is that, when I was young, you could at least have some belief that the Labour Party, the opposition party, represented working people in this country and offered some hope to working people. You might have been wrong about that, but you could believe it. Now, I think few people, after the experience of Tony Blair, could believe that Labour is really offering anything fundamentally to working people. There's really no voice for these people. There's no debate on these issues, first of all, and secondly, there is no voice. There's a few exceptions, but there is little in terms of formal political structures, and that's one of the problems they have. We've seen MPs fiddling their expenses on a massive scale and by and large getting away with it scot-free. We've seen a media hacking into people's phones with the police selling them with information and a whitewash attempted on that. We've seen a series of scandals at the top of public life, and we see this economic crisis that Professor Shakespeare is talking about, where the bankers created this mess and get away with it scot-free. And there there is no public debate about these things. The debate is on the fringes. It's actually on the streets. It's on the streets tonight in parts of Great Britain. But it's not within the formal political establishment. It's not in Westminster, in the House of Commons, where there is really no opposition voices there. You know, and that is a problem. When you hollow out democracy, well, as has happened in Britain and elsewhere in the Western world, you exclude people. And when you exclude people from the democratic process, when they feel they have no voice, they're going to find ways of expressing themselves, and the most elemental way of expressing yourself is a riot.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid we have run out of time. A very interesting conversation going on there. That was Chris Bambery, political commentator, joining us from London. Also on the line from London was Professor of Binary Economics, Rodney Shakespeare.